Now that we have discussed about triangles and quadrilaterals with their varied properties, now comes the most important theorem in the topic of quadrilaterals or in the topic of triangles called Midpoint Theorem. So let's see what a midpoint theorem is. Midpoint Theorem. So what is a midpoint theorem? As a theorem itself clearly says midpoint, therefore I see that this theorem is related to a midpoint taken on a line segment. We all know what a midpoint is. Just to recap, if I take a line segment AB, then exactly the middle point, which is exactly in the middle of A and B, is called midpoint. So in case of this line segment, this equals this, and M is called midpoint of line segment AB, is how we understand the midpoint of a line AB. Here is M, exactly in the middle. So let's see the midpoint theorem in brief. So let's derive the statement before we come to the understanding of midpoint theorem. The statement. The statement says the line joining the midpoints of any two sides, the line joining the midpoints of any two sides of a triangle is parallel to the third side. Is how we define a midpoint theorem. So midpoint theorem states the line joining the midpoints of any two sides of a triangle is parallel to the third side. So let's see the statement in brief. Now this whole theorem is related to a triangle. So let me take a triangle ABC. So here is the triangle A, B, and C. Now the theorem says the line joining the midpoints of any two sides of a triangle. So let me take the midpoints of any two sides and then connect the two midpoints so that I get a line. Is how I understand the first part of the statement of the theorem. So here let me take the midpoint of AB, which is say denoted by D, and let me take the midpoint of AC at E. Just like the midpoint of AB here is M, which is exactly in the middle, same way D is exactly in the middle of AB and the point E is exactly in the middle of AC. Now let me join the line DE. So I have a line segment connecting the two midpoints D and E. So the line referred here is nothing but the line DE in the diagram of triangle ABC. Now it says that the line which joins the midpoints of any two sides of a triangle, in this case being DE, is parallel to the third side. Midpoint theorem says such a line which exists connecting the two midpoints must be parallel to the third side. Is how we understand the midpoint theorem. So midpoint theorem connected with two midpoint lines are parallel to the third side. So here DE is parallel to BC. Let D be midpoint of AB and E be midpoint of AC. AC. Now the next step is that I join DE. So once I get DE, now the midpoint theorem says midpoint theorem says that DE is parallel to BC. Is how I understand the midpoint theorem. The line joining the midpoints of any two sides of a triangle is parallel to the third side. It need not be the midpoints of these two sides. If I take the midpoints of these two sides, then that line must be parallel to this. If I take the midpoints of these two sides, then the line joining the midpoints must be parallel to this side. Is how I understand through the statement of midpoint theorem. Midpoint theorem connects the parallel lines with the midpoint concept. Now that we have defined the midpoint theorem connected with the parallelity of the two midpoints joined for the two sides of a triangle, now let's see the extension of the midpoint theorem. There is an extended property which relates to the midpoint theorem. So let's see the extension of midpoint theorem. Extension. So the extension of midpoint theorem says that, before that, let's recap with the midpoint theorem. Now the midpoint theorem says, if I take a triangle A, B, C, and I connect the midpoints, midpoint of AB being D and midpoint of AC being E, then the line which joins the two midpoints, we know that it is parallel to this. That's how we have understood midpoint theorem in the previous session. Now with this parallelity, let's see the extension property of midpoint theorem. So along with DE being parallel to BC, by midpoint theorem, DE is parallel to BC. But the extension property says that the length DE will exactly be half of the length of the third side BC. So let's see the extension mathematically. Extension of midpoint theorem says that length of the line segment DE is exactly half of the length of its third side, which is BC. So this length must be half of this. If this is 12 centimeters, this must be 6 centimeters. If this is 7 centimeters, this must be 3.5 centimeters. Is how we understand the midpoint theorem connected with the extension. So here simply I can write this as DE is half BC, or I can also write this as BC is twice of DE. Is how I understand the extension. So my theorem for extension says, if a line joining the midpoints of two sides of a triangle is parallel to third side and also is exactly half of the third side. So my statement goes like this. The line joining the midpoints of any two sides the line joining the midpoints of any two sides of a triangle is parallel to the third side and exactly half of it. This is what defines the extension of the midpoint theorem. So now proudly I can define or state the midpoint theorem as the line joining the midpoints of any two sides of a triangle is parallel to the third side and exactly half of it is how we can relate the midpoint theorem completely in its own understanding. So the statement is how we define midpoint theorem and its extension connected with midpoints and parallelity.
If you like this video, please give a thumbs up. Please subscribe to our channel to get more videos on CBSE syllabus.